isip nga ako ba kaya abang
هاي سبحان الله كيف شايفين العظام كيف جمعوها وحطوها في قبر واحد.
What if something locked away for millennia is not deliberately sought, but revealed purely by accident? Right now, the Euphrates River is rapidly drying up, exposing things that were meant to remain buried forever. In the tributary area near the Syrian border, as the water recedes dramatically, a deep, pitch-black cave suddenly emerges. Unlike anything ever left by known creatures, clearly intentional, as if built for a purpose far beyond simple shelter. Researchers quickly rushed in, and what they found inside has left many stunned. Some interpret this as symbolic, others see it as an echo of ancient tales. But one thing becomes clear: this was never meant to be found. So what exactly did they find? What kind of forbidden force was never meant to see the light of day? If this message resonates with you, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. For generations, believers have repeated the same omen. When the waters pull back, the veiled ones stir from their sleep. The ancient prophecies spoke of a time when the earth would surrender its forbidden knowledge in the final days. In recent weeks, a wave of bizarre phenomena has been reported across the Middle East, especially in the Iraq-Syria-Turkey triangle. Unexplained earthquakes and river sections suddenly changing color. Yet as the waters continue to recede, something no one expected happens. A mild but distinct tremor suddenly shook the region, causing large sections of the riverbank and hardened sediment to shift and collapse. Scientists from the Syrian Institute of Ancient History immediately moved in. From beneath the fallen earth, a hidden entrance has now emerged, sealed, undisturbed, and hidden from human eyes for thousands of years. When a small team of researchers carefully made their way through the narrow opening, their lights revealed a vast underground chamber, silent yet overwhelming in its presence. The walls were covered in inscriptions no scholar could identify, symbols that did not match any known Mesopotamian language, as if they belonged to a forgotten or forbidden record of history. These markings were not ordinary carvings. They possessed a faint, almost unnatural reflectivity. When the beams of light struck them, the characters seemed to shimmer and shift, creating the eerie illusion that the ancient curses were dancing across the stone. At the very heart of the chamber loomed four colossal stone platforms, aligned with a chilling, ritualistic precision that felt disturbingly intentional. Embedded deep within each structure were four enormous rings forged from a strange, otherworldly alloy, a metal that remained eerily pristine, showing not a single trace of rust or corrosion despite thousands of years in the damp, suffocating humidity of the Euphrates basin. The rings were deeply gouged and scarred, as though something monstrous had once thrashed and strained against them with unimaginable fury. Carved menacingly into the stone directly above were figures unlike anything found in ancient art. Winged beings, not in glory, but violently bound in chains, their bodies contorted in agony, their faces twisted in seething anguish and defiant rage. It is difficult not to wonder what kind of memory these walls were preserving. The resemblance to a specific biblical prophecy is impossible to ignore. Revelation 9 verse 14 says, "Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." And the four angels who had been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. In the biblical story, God has always set boundaries between light and darkness, obedience and rebellion, mercy and judgment. From the Garden of Eden to the flood in the days of Noah, when humanity crossed those boundaries, divine restraint followed. Could it be that this chamber is not merely symbolic, but literal, a prison sealed by God himself? Beyond the main chamber, a narrow tunnel, almost hidden from sight, led the explorers into a second, smaller room. What they found there changed everything. At the center of the chamber lay a body, tightly wrapped in ancient, brittle cloth. It was preserved in a way that felt deliberate, not natural. This was not a burial. It was placement done with purpose. Surrounding the body were objects that immediately raised alarm. Obsidian blades, tablets marked with unknown symbols, and ritual tools made from gold and bone. The obsidian knives were not simply placed nearby. They had been driven straight into the ground, forming a precise pattern encircling the body like a ritual formation. Golden chains did not rest loosely over the figure. They pierced through the burial cloth itself, driven downward and fastened deep into heavy stone blocks set into the floor, as if to hold the body in place. These were not items of mourning. They were tools of control. Everything in this room pointed to sealing, not honoring, containment, not remembrance. As the team moved closer, something else became clear, something far more disturbing. Standing beside the body, they realized its true size. It was not human. The figure stretched to nearly 3, perhaps even 4 meters in length. Carefully, they lifted a small section of cloth near the head. Light fell across what lay beneath, and several stepped back in shock. The skull was not human. The eye sockets were far too large, deep and hollow, and within the partially exposed jaw were rows of sharp, doubled teeth, layered in a way no human anatomy could explain. It is hard not to ask what this being once was. A guardian left to watch over something below? A priest of rituals long forgotten? Or something far older, something from a time when the world itself was different? Scholars and theologians quickly pointed to Genesis 6, where the Nephilim are described, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. These beings were said to be mighty, but part of a world so corrupted that judgment became unavoidable. The Book of Enoch expands on this, describing their unnatural size, their influence in leading humanity astray, and their destruction in the flood. Was this one of them, or a servant, a remnant of that ancient corruption? Its presence here, so close to what may be a prison for the bound angels, feels impossible to ignore. Standing in this chamber, surrounded by signs of ritual restraint and staring at a figure preserved with such intention, the story no longer feels distant, feels real, feels close. Could it be that what was sealed long ago is now rising, piece by piece? Hold on for a moment before we go deeper. Take a second to like the video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if this message is stirring something in your spirit, stay with me, because what comes next only deepens the mystery. And then came the discovery no one could explain. An object that did not belong there, could not belong there, and yet was undeniably real. Buried deep in the thick, dark sediment of the Euphrates basin, divers uncovered a circular structure, corroded, heavy, and partly fused with layers of mineral buildup. First, it looked like debris, but as they cleared it away, the shape became clear. A wheel, a chariot wheel. Its form was unmistakable. The spokes, the metal rim, the design all matched what is known from the Bronze Age, especially the kind used in ancient Egyptian warfare. This is where confusion turned into shock. Historians quickly recognized it. This was not local. It did not match Mesopotamian design. It closely mirrored Egyptian military engineering, the same kind of will linked to Pharaoh's army in one of the most powerful moments described in the Bible. But something else made the scene far more disturbing. The wheel was not lying there alone. Scattered around it were fossilized human bones, dozens of them, preserved in the hardened riverbed. And their positions told a story. These were not the remains of people who drowned. Their bodies were twisted, stretched forward, arms extended, as if they had been trying to run, to escape. Not from the surface, but from something rising up beneath the river itself. Then came the most chilling detail. The wheel was not simply damaged by time or water pressure. It was warped, crushed inward in unnatural ways. Deep grooves and jagged marks cut across the metal, as if it had been gripped and torn apart by something with massive claws. How does an object tied so closely to the Exodus appear in the Euphrates River? The biblical account describes the moment God intervened, when the waters parted to deliver his people, then closed again to bring judgment on those who pursued them. Chariots, soldiers, power, pride, all swallowed in an instant. For thousands of years, that story has stood as a symbol of divine authority over human strength. While many have speculated about chariot remains in the Red Sea, few ever imagined a connection to the Euphrates. Could these be remnants of that ancient judgment, moved, scattered, or revealed for a reason. Is this will just an artifact or a warning? Just as chariots once represented the pride of man and were broken in a single moment, could this broken will now be a sign of what is coming next? Because if something buried for thousands of years can rise again, what else is still down there, waiting? While sifting through thick layers of sediment, divers uncovered a single gold coin. At first, it seemed ordinary, worn down, its surface dulled by centuries underwater. But once it was cleaned, everything changed. The image was clear and deeply unsettling. On one side sat a figure on a throne, crowned, winged, and full of authority. It was not human, not anything recognized as divine. It was something else, something that ruled. The other side was even more disturbing. A star-shaped symbol spread outward, surrounded by flame-like patterns that twisted like moving serpents. The design matched no known empire, no recorded dynasty, no belief system from the region. It stood alone, unknown, unclassified, and clearly intentional. Scholars struggled to explain it. Some suggested it came from a lost cult, a hidden system of worship erased from history. Then the analysis went further. When the coin was placed under spectrographic scanning, researchers were horrified to find that its age reached far beyond even the oldest known Mesopotamian civilizations. Even more shocking, the metal itself was not pure gold. It was a strange, unknown alloy, something never recorded before, showing an unnatural resistance to corrosion, untouched by time, water, or even harsh chemical exposure. Others began to suggest something more unsettling. This may not have been currency at all. It could have been a token, an offering, a mark of allegiance given to something unseen, something below. That idea moves into dangerous ground. Scripture has long warned of a different kind of worship, one that does not honor God, but turns devotion toward false powers. In ancient times, entire civilizations were pulled into this deception. They gave sacrifices, loyalty, even identity to forces that stood against the Creator. Some passages describe idols not as empty objects, but as doorways, connections to something darker behind them. Systems that looked powerful, even divine, but led people away from truth and into bondage. Looking at this coin, the pattern feels the same. A throne, a crown, a symbol that demands recognition, and the question becomes harder to ignore. If this was a sign of allegiance, then allegiance to what? Because whatever it represented, it was important enough to be preserved. And now, like everything else beneath the Euphrates, it is rising again. Only days after the strange coin was recovered, a new wave of fear spread through the villages along the Euphrates. This time, it was not something buried. It was something alive. Witnesses spoke with shaking voices. At the edge of the river, where the water had pulled back into shallow, muddy streams, something massive rose from below. First, it looked like a crocodile, but as it lifted higher, it became clear this was no normal creature. Nearly 30 feet long, its body was covered in dark, armor-like scales that caught the light in sharp, broken reflections. Its eyes burned with a deep red glow. It moved violently, unnaturally, thrashing through reeds before vanishing back into the water with terrifying speed. And the moment it appeared, something else changed. The Euphrates, already drying and weakened, began to turn red, like blood spreading through the water. The air itself grew heavy, thick with the smell of sulfur and ash, as if something from deep below had been released along with it. Some claimed they saw markings along its back, lines and shapes that did not look natural but carved deliberate. Fear spread quickly, not just because of what it was, but because of when it appeared. Then came something even harder to explain. The villagers did not just see the creature. Many of them began to dream the same dream. Night after night, they described a winged king sitting on a throne, the same image found on the coin, watching in silence as if waiting. Genesis describes a time when the world stood on the edge of total corruption. A time when what God created had been changed, not only in the hearts of men, but in all living things. The text says clearly, "All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth." That line has always carried weight. It points to something deeper than human failure, something that reached into the very structure of life itself. Biblical scholars often point to Genesis 6 verse 12. Ancient writings suggest that before the flood, the Nephilim, the offspring of fallen angels and human women, brought widespread corruption, not only to humanity, but to animals as well. Could this creature be a survivor of that world? A living remnant from before the flood, hidden in darkness beneath the Euphrates? Its sudden appearance, at the same time the river is drying, the chamber is opening, feels too precise to ignore. This may not just be a creature. It may be a warning. Because when things long buried begin to rise, it means something deeper has already been set in motion. As the waters of the Euphrates kept pulling back, revealing what had long been hidden, one final discovery appeared near the entrance of the sealed cave. This was not just another artifact. Carried weight, historical, and something more. Half buried in the mud, standing upright as if placed there on purpose, archaeologists uncovered a stone statue unlike anything else at the site. At first, it looked like a typical object from ancient Mesopotamia. But as the dirt was cleared away, the feeling around it changed. The figure sat on a throne, stiff and commanding, both hands stretched forward as if still waiting to receive something. A crown of horns rose from its head, and behind it, a carved circular disc framed it like a false halo. Then came a detail no one expected. On one of its outstretched hands, researchers found a narrow groove, perfectly shaped, precisely cut, as if it had been made to hold something specific. When they compared it to the gold coin recovered earlier, the match was exact. The coin fit into the groove as if it had always belonged there. At the base of the statue, more carvings came into view. Images of war horses, chariot wheels like the one found beneath the river, and towering giant figures, beings resembling the Nephilim, were etched into the stone in repeating patterns. Beneath the surface, carved in ancient script, was a name that has echoed through scripture for generations. Baal. This was not just a cultural relic. It pointed directly to one of the most dangerous spiritual deceptions in biblical history. During the reign of King Ahab under Queen Jezebel's influence, the worship of Baal spread across Israel. It replaced devotion to God with rituals that looked powerful, but led to destruction. Altars were raised. Sacrifices were made. What seemed like worship hid something much darker underneath. The clearest moment came when the prophet Elijah stood alone on Mount Carmel against hundreds of Baal's prophets. They cried out all day, performed their rituals, but nothing answered. No voice, no power. Then Elijah rebuilt the altar of the Lord, poured water over it, and prayed. And fire fell from heaven, consuming everything. In that moment, the truth was clear. That event was not just a victory. It was a warning. False worship does not just mislead. It opens the door to something that stands against God. Now, standing before the statue rising again from the Euphrates, at the same time as all these other discoveries, the connection is hard to ignore. And then something happened that no one could explain. As the sun reached the highest point of the horned crown, a beam of light reflected from the statue, sharp and direct, shooting outward toward the sealed cave entrance, as if pointing or activating something. Baal was never just a name carved in stone. It represented a pattern, a turning away from truth toward something that only looks powerful. And now, with this statue rising, the river uncovering what was buried, and the signs aligning with unsettling precision, it no longer feels like the past is being studied. Feels like it is returning. And if the same symbols of rebellion are appearing again, then the real question is no longer about history. It is whether the warning is being seen before it is too late. Across the world, from crowded cities to quiet villages, people began reporting the same chilling event. A sound, metallic, deep, and echoing across the sky with no clear source. It was not thunder, not machinery, not anything familiar. Witnesses described it as layered, almost like a signal instead of random noise. Some said the air itself seemed to vibrate. Others said that the moment they heard it, a heavy feeling came over them, as if something unseen had stepped into the world. What makes it more disturbing is how consistent it is. The same sound, heard in different countries, different climates, different times. yet always carrying the same tone, the same unnatural depth. Scientists have tried to explain it: tectonic shifts, pressure waves, distant industrial noise. But none of these fully explain what people are hearing or feeling. And then something changed. The sound did not just echo, it began to affect the world around it. Clouds gathered and twisted into strange formations, shaped like massive armies moving across the sky. Rivers, some of the largest on Earth, began to behave unnaturally, their waters slowing, then reversing direction, flowing backward as if pulled by an unseen force. This is where it becomes impossible to ignore, because in Scripture, sound is never without purpose. In the book of Joshua, before the walls of Jericho fell, the people marched in silence, until the moment came when the horns were lifted and the sound broke the stillness. It was not weapons that brought the walls down. It was obedience, followed by a sound that marked divine action. And then there is the writing of the Apostle Paul. He speaks of a future moment that will not come quietly: a command, a voice, and a trumpet, not from man but from God. A sound that signals a turning point for all humanity. Sound in these moments is not background. It is a trigger, a signal that something is about to change. Now picture this. Archaeologists stand before the statue of Baal, just uncovered from the Euphrates. The air is still. The river behind them is silent. Then the sound comes again, louder, deeper, like a horn echoing across the sky. And as it rings out, the impossible happens. The stone statue, cold, solid, lifeless, begins to change. From its surface, dark liquid starts to form, slowly seeping out like blood running down its carved face and hands. No one moves, no one speaks, because at that moment it no longer feels like a sound, feels like a signal. And if history has shown anything, it is that when the sound comes first, something always follows. It should have been completely dry. From the surface, the Euphrates looks like it's dying. Cracked earth, exposed stone, silence where water once moved. But beneath that dead riverbed, something doesn't add up. Deep below the exposed layers, hidden channels are still flowing. Explorers who pushed further into the underground sections began to notice it first, not by sight, but by sound. A faint, steady movement echoing through the chambers. Not dripping, not stagnant, flowing. When they finally reached it, they found narrow streams cutting through the darkness, untouched by the drought above. The water was colder, clearer, and moving with purpose, as if it had never been affected at all. This wasn't leftover moisture trapped in the earth. It was a system active, hidden, and separate from the river that once covered it. Even more unsettling, these underground currents didn't follow the path of the Euphrates above. They branched off, leading deeper into areas no one had mapped, feeding into spaces that shouldn't exist beneath a riverbed that old. Some began to question whether the river had ever truly been just a surface phenomenon. Because if water is still flowing below, then whatever lies deeper has never been exposed, only concealed. The deeper they went, the water was no longer the first thing they noticed. It was the air. At first, it was subtle, a faint, bitter edge with every breath. Easy to ignore, easy to explain away as trapped moisture or decaying minerals. But within minutes, it changed. The atmosphere grew heavy. Breathing became slower, thicker, as if the space itself resisted it. And then the smell became unmistakable. Sulfur, sharp, acrid, burning the back of the throat. The kind of scent usually tied to volcanic depths or ruptures far below the Earth's crust. Places no river system should ever connect to. But this wasn't just a passing pocket. The deeper chambers were saturated with it. Walls stained darker, air that seemed to cling to the lungs. Even equipment began to react. Metal showing strange discoloration, surfaces corroding faster than expected. Some explorers reported dizziness. Others described a pressure in their heads, like something tightening the deeper they went. And yet, there was no visible source, no vents, no fissures releasing gas, no heat signatures strong enough to explain it. Just that smell, growing stronger the closer they moved toward the sealed sections. In ancient texts, sulfur was never just a natural element. It was always associated with judgment, with destruction, with places humanity was never meant to enter. Which raises a question no one could ignore anymore. If this air is coming from deeper below, then what exactly is producing it? At first, they trusted their equipment. High-powered lights cut through the darkness. Cameras documented every step. Sensors tracked movement, temperature, air quality, everything was controlled, measured, understood. Until it wasn't. It started with flickers. A light would dim for half a second, then stabilize. A camera would glitch, static crawling across the screen before clearing. Small things, easy to dismiss in an underground environment. But the deeper they moved, the more frequent it became. Lights didn't just flicker anymore. They pulsed, as if reacting to something unseen. Batteries drained faster than they should. Devices that had been fully charged began shutting down without warning. Then came the interference. Footage captured in lower chambers wasn't just distorted, it was corrupted. Frames warped. Shapes stretched unnaturally. In some recordings, shadows appeared where nothing had been standing moments before. And then total failure. Entire systems went dark at once. No gradual loss. No warning signals. Just an instant collapse, as if something had cut through every connection simultaneously. For a few seconds, there was nothing. No light. No data. No confirmation of where anyone was standing. Just the silence of the chambers. And the feeling that they were no longer observing the environment, but being observed by it. When backup systems finally came online, something didn't match. Timestamps were off. Minutes were missing. And in at least one recovered clip, the camera had kept recording, even after the operator swore it had already shut down. Which leaves one possibility that no one wanted to say out loud. The deeper they went, the less control they had. And whatever was down there was starting to interfere. At first, they blamed the tunnels. Sound behaves strangely underground. Echoes bend, distances distort, footsteps return from directions they shouldn't. That was the explanation, until the sounds stopped acting like echoes. It began as something faint. A tone buried beneath the usual noise of movement, so quiet it could have been dismissed as airflow through narrow passages. But it wasn't consistent. It shifted. Some explorers described it as a low murmur, layered, uneven, like multiple voices overlapping just beyond comprehension. Not loud enough to identify, but too structured to be random. They tried to trace it. Every time they moved toward it, the sound seemed to pull away. Never closer, never clearer. Always just out of reach. Then came the recordings. Audio picked up fragments the human ear hadn't fully registered in the moment. When played back, the team noticed patterns. Pauses where there shouldn't be pauses, rises and falls that resembled speech. Not clear words. Not any known language. But something organized. More unsettling still, the voices didn't behave like normal sound waves. In certain chambers, they didn't echo at all. They just existed, flat, directionless, as if they weren't traveling through space but originating from it. One explorer reported hearing his own name. No one else confirmed it. No recording captured it. But he insisted it hadn't come from behind, ahead, or above. Came from everywhere at once. After that, they stopped trying to follow the sound. Because the deeper realization was harder to ignore. Echoes repeat what already exists, but this felt like something responding. They didn't expect to find symmetry. Up to that point, everything beneath the Euphrates felt fragmented. Collapsed tunnels, uneven chambers, scattered remnants of something long buried. But deeper in, the layout changed. It became intentional. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and at its center stood four massive pillars, perfectly aligned, equidistant from one another, forming a square no natural process could create. They weren't decorative. They were functional. Each pillar was carved from a single block of stone, rising from floor to ceiling with no visible joints. Their surfaces were worn, but not randomly. Patterns circled them in repeating bands, etched deep as if meant to last beyond time itself. And at their base, the ground was different. scored, pressed, marked by something that had once been anchored there. This wasn't a place of gathering. It wasn't a temple. It wasn't a passage. It was a structure built around a center point, something that was no longer there, or no longer visible. What made it worse was the spacing. Too precise, too deliberate, as if the distance between each pillar wasn't arbitrary, but calculated to contain something of a specific size or force. Some began to connect it to ancient texts, descriptions of beings not imprisoned by walls, but by boundaries, held not by cages but by positions fixed in place. And suddenly, the chamber didn't feel empty anymore, felt incomplete, like something had been removed or released, and the structure that remained was only the outline of what once stood there. At first, they tried to interpret it as architecture. The pillars, the spacing, the markings. It was easier to believe it had been built to hold something up, to support a ceiling, to define a space, to serve a purpose that made sense. But the deeper they analyzed it, the less that explanation held. Nothing about the structure aligned with support. The pillars weren't positioned where weight would naturally distribute. There were no fractures above them, no signs of collapse, no stress patterns in the stone. If anything, the ceiling showed no dependence on them at all, which meant they weren't holding anything up. They were holding something in. The markings carved into each pillar began to stand out more clearly, bands repeating at measured intervals, wrapping around the stone like constraints rather than decoration. When mapped together, the symbols didn't form a story. They formed a system, pattern of containment. And then there were the chains, massive, corroded lengths embedded into the ground around the central space, far too large for any known practical use. Their positioning wasn't random. Each one aligned with the pillars, angled inward, all pointing toward the same empty center. Whatever had been here had been fixed in place from multiple directions, not trapped casually, not buried by accident, restrained. Some began to draw a connection that no one wanted to fully state. Ancient descriptions of beings bound, not destroyed, held at specific locations, awaiting a moment when those restraints would no longer hold. And if that interpretation was even close to true, then the most unsettling detail wasn't the structure itself. It was its current state, because the chains were no longer under tension. The center was no longer occupied, and the system that once held everything in place was no longer active. At first, the movement was so slight it barely registered. A vibration underfoot, brief, almost like distant machinery. Easy to dismiss, easy to ignore in a place already filled with unknowns. But it didn't stay subtle. The tremors began returning at irregular intervals. Not strong enough to collapse anything, but too deliberate to feel natural. They didn't roll through the earth like typical seismic waves. They pulsed, short, contained, almost localized, centered somewhere beneath the deepest chambers. Sensors picked it up next. Readings showed microshifts in the earth structure. Tight, concentrated movements that didn't match known fault lines in the region. No tectonic explanation, no external trigger, just activity. And it was increasing. Dust fell from above in thin streams. Fine cracks began forming along previously stable surfaces, not spreading outward but inward, as if pressure was building from below rather than above. Even more unsettling, the timing didn't feel random. The tremors seemed to follow a pattern. Not perfectly rhythmic, but close enough to suggest repetition, like something building, pausing, then pushing again. Explorers reported feeling it through their bodies before instruments even confirmed it. A low, internal vibration, more sensed than heard. And in the chamber with the 4 pillars, it was strongest. Standing there, the ground didn't just shake. It hummed. A constant, underlying resonance, as if the entire structure was reacting to something far beneath it. Something moving. Or worse, something trying to move. At that point, the theory began to shift again. Because if the structure had been designed to restrain, and the restraints were no longer active, then these tremors might not be geological at all. They might be the first signs that whatever had been held there was no longer staying still. At first, they called it drought. reduced rainfall, upstream dams, climate patterns shifting over time. All reasonable explanations for why the Euphrates was shrinking. But the timeline didn't match. What should have taken decades was happening in months. Satellite comparisons revealed something impossible to ignore. Entire stretches of the river were disappearing at a rate far beyond historical records. Sections that once held steady water levels were now exposed completely, cracked, hollow, and expanding day by day. And it wasn't uniform. Certain areas were receding faster than others, specifically the same regions where the underground structures had begun to appear, as if the water wasn't just evaporating, but withdrawing. Locals began noticing it first. Shorelines shifting overnight, pockets of water collapsing inward, draining into unseen openings below. In some places, the surface didn't dry gradually. It gave way, as though something beneath had opened and pulled the river down into itself. Hydrologists tried to map the flow, but the models broke. Water wasn't following expected paths anymore. It wasn't dispersing outward into surrounding areas. It was vanishing, redirected into channels that didn't exist on any geological survey. Channels that led down, toward the same depths where the pillars stood, where the chains lay dormant, where the air turned sulfurous and the ground began to pulse. And then came the most unsettling realization. The river wasn't just shrinking. It was being emptied, not randomly, not naturally, but in a way that seemed to expose something layer by layer, like a covering being deliberately removed, which forces a question no one could comfortably answer. If the Euphrates is being drained from below, then what exactly is making room to be uncovered? The first reports didn't come from scientists. They came from people living near the drying stretches, those who had watched the Euphrates their entire lives and knew exactly how the sky above it was supposed to look. They all said the same thing. Something had changed. At night, faint lights began appearing over the exposed structure. Subtle at first, easy to mistake for distant aircraft or atmospheric reflections. But they didn't move like anything familiar. They hovered, not drifting with the wind, not crossing the horizon, just holding position directly above the areas where the river had receded the most. Then they started to shift. Slow, deliberate movements, gliding in short distances, stopping abruptly, then realigning as if responding to something below rather than above. Some nights, there was only one. Other times, several appeared at once, forming loose patterns, never symmetrical but never random either. Always centered over the same Nakaarthan along the exposed riverbed. Witnesses described their color as inconsistent, white at a distance, bluish when closer, and occasionally, brief flashes of something warmer, almost like a dim ember pulsing beneath the surface. No sound accompanied them, no engines, no vibration, just silent motion against a sky that otherwise remained completely still. Attempts to record them rarely succeeded. Cameras struggled to focus. Footage blurred or lost clarity the moment the lights intensified. In some cases, the lights didn't appear in recordings at all. Only the empty sky where witnesses insisted they had been seconds before. But the most unsettling detail wasn't their movement. It was their timing. The lights appeared most frequently after ground tremors, after sudden drops in water levels, after moments when something below seemed to shift, as if they weren't random atmospheric phenomena, but reactions, or signals, and always, without exception, they stayed above the same regions where the deepest structures had been found. Which raises a possibility no one wanted to consider. These lights aren't passing through the sky. They're watching something beneath it. First, no one noticed what was missing. The focus had been on what was appearing. Structures, carvings, openings into the Ardha. But slowly, a different pattern began to emerge. Not presence, absence. In areas closest to the exposed sections of the Euphrates, life began to thin out. Birds that once followed the river's edge were no longer there. No flocks crossing overhead. No calls at dawn or dusk. Even insects, normally impossible to eliminate, seemed to vanish from certain stretches. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. One day, movement. The next, stillness. Locals described it as unnatural. Not just fewer animals, but a complete avoidance, as if something had marked those zones as off-limits. Even livestock reacted. Animals brought near the exposed Manaataka became restless. They refused to move forward, pulling back against restraints, agitated without any visible threat. Some wouldn't drink from the remaining water. Others wouldn't even face the direction of the dried riverbed. And then there were the dogs. Several reports described them reacting before anything else. Stopping suddenly, ears raised, staring toward the openings in the Ardha. Not barking, not approaching, just watching, as if they sensed something that wasn't visible. Researchers attempted to document it, setting up motion-triggered cameras, tracking activity patterns across different zones. The results were consistent. Where the Ardha remained untouched, life continued as expected. Movement, sound, balance. But near the exposed structures, nothing. No tracks, no feeding patterns, no signs of nesting or migration. Just empty ground, stretching outward from the Samnika earthen where everything else had begun to surface. It wasn't just that animals were leaving. They were refusing to enter. And in nature, that kind of behavior doesn't happen without cause. Because animals don't need explanations. They don't need evidence. They respond to threat long before humans can define it. Which leaves a quiet, unsettling conclusion. If every living thing is avoiding this place, then whatever is beneath the Euphrates isn't just being uncovered. It's being recognized. By the time they mapped the lower levels, one detail stood out above everything else. There was still something deeper. Not a theory, not a guess. The scans showed it clearly. A void beneath the known chambers. Larger than anything they had already uncovered. Perfectly enclosed. Separated by a dense layer of rock that didn't match the surrounding. It looked intentional, like a final barrier. At first, they assumed it was just another collapsed section. But the readings didn't support that. The space below wasn't filled with debris. It was empty, completely hollow. A chamber that had never been opened, or never meant to be. Attempts were made to reach it. Drilling equipment was brought in. Precision tools designed to cut through dense stone. The first contact with the barrier was promising. The outer layer gave way easier than expected. Too easy. Then everything changed. The deeper the drill pushed, the more unstable the readings became. Instruments began to spike without clear cause. Vibrations increased, not from the machinery, but from the earth itself, responding in sharp, irregular bursts. And then, it stopped. Not because the team chose to stop, because the equipment failed. Simultaneously, power systems shut down. Mechanical components locked in place as if seized by an unseen force. Even backup tools refused to function once brought near the same river. It wasn't just malfunction. It was resistance. Further attempts were abandoned not by decision but by limitation. Every method failed before reaching the inner boundary. Every approach met the same result. The chamber remained sealed, untouched, and yet one final detail made it impossible to ignore. Thermal scans. While the surrounding Ardhu remained cold and stable, the interior of that chamber showed faint, fluctuating heat signatures. Not constant, not random, but shifting, as if something inside was generating it. Not enough to break through, not enough to be seen, but enough to confirm one thing. That space wasn't empty. It never had been. And whatever was inside was still there. For centuries, the Euphrates wasn't just a river. It was a barrier. Its waters carved boundaries, sustained civilizations, and, whether anyone realized it or not, kept something buried. Layer upon layer of sediment, pressure, and time sealed whatever lay beneath. Hidden under a surface no one questioned. Until now. Because what's happening isn't just exposure. It's reversal. The more the river disappears, the more the past doesn't simply reappear. It rises in sequence. Foundations, entrances, chambers, structures that feel less like ruins and more like stages of something deliberately concealed. As if the water hadn't just covered them, but protected something from being found. or prevented something from being released. Ancient flood accounts begin to take on a different weight. Stories once understood as destruction start to resemble containment. Events that didn't just wipe the surface clean, but buried what couldn't be dealt with any other way. Not erased, submerged, held under constant pressure by something vast enough to keep it sealed indefinitely. And now that pressure is gone. Not all at once, not violently, but steadily, precisely, like a system unwinding. The exposed layers don't feel random. Each new discovery connects to the one before it, guiding deeper, closer to the same central point. The pillars, the chamber, the sealed space below, which raises a possibility that changes everything. What if the Euphrates didn't just happen to flow over this place? What if it was meant to, placed there, by nature or by something far older, as a covering that ensured nothing beneath it would ever be disturbed? Because if that's true, then what we're witnessing now isn't just a river drying. It's the removal of a boundary, and whatever that boundary was holding back is closer to being uncovered than it has ever been. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every layer uncovered beneath the Euphrates didn't just reveal something new. It revealed something deeper, something more controlled, more deliberate. Nothing felt accidental anymore, and that changed the question entirely, because this was no longer just about discovery. It was about intent. At first, the narrative was simple. An ancient river drying, exposing remnants of lost civilizations. A rare opportunity to study what time had hidden. But the deeper they went, the harder that explanation became to hold on to. Structures that didn't match known history. Materials that didn't behave like anything familiar. Patterns that suggested containment, not habitation. And now, signs that whatever system had once held it all in place was no longer functioning. So the question shifted. Was this meant to be found? Or was it meant to stay buried? Some argued this was a breakthrough, a once-in-history uncovering of something extraordinary. That whatever lay beneath was simply waiting for the right moment to be revealed. But others saw it differently. They pointed to the chains. The sealed chamber. The unnatural silence of life above. The tremors. The sound. The air. None of it suggested something meant to be discovered. It suggested something meant to be contained. And if that's true, then uncovering it isn't progress. It's interference. Because throughout history, warnings were rarely labeled as such. They weren't always written in clear language or left in obvious places. Sometimes they were embedded in the design itself, in the way something was hidden, sealed, and kept out of reach. Not to protect it, but to protect everything else. Standing at the edge of what had been uncovered, the realization became unavoidable. This might not be a door opening. It might be one that was never supposed to be opened at all. And if the boundary is already failing, then the real question isn't whether we should keep going. It's whether it's already too late to stop. By this point, the evidence didn't feel disconnected anymore. It aligned. The drying river, the descending structures, the pillars, the chains, the sealed chamber that resisted every attempt to reach it. The sound beneath the ardha, the tremors that felt less like movement and more like pressure. Individually, each detail could still be debated. Together, they formed something harder to dismiss. A pattern that pointed in one direction. Not collapse, not coincidence, but release. Ancient references began resurfacing, not as distant mythology, but as descriptions that felt uncomfortably specific. Writings that spoke of beings not destroyed, but bound. Not gone, but held in place waiting. And always connected to a location, a boundary, a moment when that boundary would no longer hold. For the first time, the structure beneath the Euphrates wasn't being viewed as ruins of the past, but as part of a system that had lasted until now. A system that was failing. The most unsettling part wasn't the idea that something had been restrained. It was the possibility that the restraint had worked for a very long time. Which means if it's no longer working, then something has changed. Not just underground, not just in the river, but in whatever conditions once made that containment possible. And that leads to the one conclusion no one could comfortably prove, but no one could fully reject either. If something was bound here, and everything holding it in place is now breaking down, then what we're witnessing isn't just exposure. It's the early stage of something being let go. Not forced, not broken free, but released, exactly when it was always going to be. What is meant by the return of Jesus? This is the most anticipated event for our generation and all future generations, also called our blessed hope in Titus 2 verse 13. It is the physical return of Jesus, the Messiah, to earth. He will put down the rebellion against God, establish his kingdom based in Jerusalem, and reign for 1,000 years. Accompanying him will be the holy angels, Matt 25:31, 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 7, Mark 8 verse 38, and all the Christians that died, Revelation 19 verse 14, Revelation 20 verse 4, Colossians 3 verse 4, or were raptured, 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 17. Christians will share in the rule of the nations with Jesus, Revelation 2 verses 26 to 28. Jesus will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and rule from there, Zechariah 6 verses 12 to 13, Zech 14:8-9, Luke 1 verses 31 to 33. It will be a time of unprecedented peace on earth since Satan will be bound in chains, Revelation 20 verse 2, and the Lord will rule with a rod of iron, Revelation 12 verse 5. Jews will return from exile and flood Israel with a population explosion, Zechariah 2 verses 4 to 5, Isaiah 11 verses 11 to 12, Zechariah 14 verse 11, Ezekiel 38 verse 8. What is Armageddon? Armageddon is used today to refer to the final battle between Jesus and the unholy Trinity, Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet and their armies. The word Armageddon only appears once in the Bible, in Revelation 16 verse 16, and actually refers to a geographic location. And I saw 3 evil spirits that looked like frogs leap from the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. They are demonic spirits who work miracles and go out to all the rulers of the world to gather them for battle against the Lord on that great judgment day of God the Almighty. And the demonic spirits gathered all the rulers and their armies to a place with the Hebrew name Armageddon. Rev 16:13-14, 16. Armageddon is the transliteration of the Hebrew phrase Har Mageddon, Hill of Mageddon in English. This is widely accepted to be modern-day Mount Megiddo. Alan Kirshner explains with 5 reasons. This hill is located north Jerusalem in the Jezreel Valley, or Esdraelon Plain. This valley has seen over 30 major conflicts in history. Napoleon called this valley the greatest battlefield on earth. Prior to his return, Jesus will not lead a coup. With the sovereignty of God in mind, it is easy to believe that God can do whatever he wants when he wants. As the creator of the heavens and the earth and all people, he does have the right to take over control at any moment. But that isn't how our perfect and loving God operates. Our God is not a dictator that takes over by sheer force. Our God is a God of order, 1 Corinthians 14 verse 33. He will not lead a coup to usurp the government of Israel and take over power. He will return when he is invited to come back, when the people of Israel elect him. Only then will his second advent be imminent. Let's see what his word tells us. For I tell you this, you will never see me again until you say, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Matthew 23 verse 39. Note this is an invitation for the Messiah. Cross-reference Luke 19 verses 36 to 39 and how the Pharisees strongly objected to those words being used. Then I will return to my place, until they admit their guilt and turn to me. For as soon as trouble comes, they will earnestly search for me. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces. Now he will heal us. He has injured us. Now he will bandage our wounds. In just a short time he will restore us, so that we may live in his presence. Hosea 5:15-6:2. But at last my people will confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors for betraying me and being hostile toward me. When I have turned their hostility back on them and brought them to the land of their enemies, then at last their stubborn hearts will be humbled, and they will pay for their sins. Lev 26:40-41. Leading up to the final battle. The future 7-year tribulation will turn the rebellious hearts of the Jews, fulfilling one of the prophecies of the 77-year periods in Daniel 9 verse 24. This isn't the desire of a loving God, but at the same time He won't let them wander away forever. This verse points to the brutality of the tribulation and the repentance it brings about. I will bring that group through the fire, and make them pure. I will refine them like silver, and purify them like gold. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, "These are my people," and they will say, "The Lord is our God." Zech 13:9. Around the midpoint of the future tribulation, the Antichrist will set up the abomination of desolation in the Jewish temple. Mark 13 verse 14, Daniel 9 verse 27. At that point, the final countdown is on and the Jews are persecuted without restraint. 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 7, Daniel 12 verse 1. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that the time of its destruction has arrived. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. Those in Jerusalem must get out, and those out in the country should not return to the city. Luke 21 verses 20 to 21. Cross-reference Matt 24:15-22 and Mark 13 verse 14. Those that do not get out of Jerusalem will face terrible abuse and genocide. Watch, for the day of the Lord is coming when your possessions will be plundered right in front of you. I will gather all the nations to fight against Jerusalem. The city will be taken, the houses looted, and the women raped. Half the population will be taken into captivity, and the rest will be left among the ruins of the city. Zechariah 14 verses 1 to 2. 2/3 of the people in the land will be cut off and die, says the Lord, but 1/3 will be left in the land. Zechariah 13 verse 8. They will be killed by the sword or sent away as captives to all the nations of the world. And Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end. Luke 21 verse 24. The initial invasion of Jerusalem sees half the Jews taken into captivity. Between those taken captive and those left in the land, 2/3 will ultimately be killed. This purifies the Jews who survive and turns their hearts to Jesus, their Messiah. Zechariah 13 verse 9. Revelation 11 verse 13. God fulfills His mysterious plan. The resurrection of the 2 witnesses and powerful earthquake end the 6th trumpet judgment. That resurrection proves to the Jews the 2 witnesses were God's messengers and their word was true. It appears this will be the time of the Jews' repentance and acceptance of Jesus. See Revelation 11 verses 10 to 14 for the context. There is a short pause between the 6th and 7th trumpets. At this time, the Jews repent and experience deep mourning for their long rejection of Jesus. Zechariah 12 verses 10 to 12. Their change of heart triggers the announcement of the 7th trumpet and the completion of God's plan. We are told by an angel that the 7th trumpet is the culmination of God's plan that the prophets, Old Testament, has predicted. When the 7th angel blows his trumpet, God's mysterious plan will be fulfilled. It will happen just as He announced it to His servants the prophets. Rev. 10:7. Then the 7th angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices shouting in heaven, "The world has now become the kingdom of our Lord and of His Christ, and He will reign forever and ever." Revelation 11 verse 15. The return of Jesus for His people is now right at the door. The 7th trumpet has announced the dethroning of Satan and coronation of Jesus as the new king of the world.
Local researchers believe they have cracked a mystery surrounding an extraordinary discovery.
Эти существа находятся здесь давно, их состояние постоянно.
Archaeologists in northern Mongolia have uncovered a 25-foot humanoid skeleton.
Something extraordinary has just been uncovered near the Euphrates River. As the river pulled back, it didn't just reveal land. It exposed a hidden descent, a tunnel leading into a 3,400-year-old city long buried beneath history. Inside, explorers found massive skeletons, footprints too large to belong to any human, and weapons built for beings far taller than us. Armor designed for figures 10 to 12 feet tall. A strange chalice resembling the Holy Grail. A sealed stone sarcophagus. And then the warning, repeated across 17 ancient languages, telling whoever finds it, do not open. If this were just one discovery, it would be easy to dismiss. But it didn't happen alone. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below if you think this is more than coincidence. The water didn't just lower, it withdrew. Along the Euphrates River, the drop became visible day by day, then hour by hour, until long sections of the riverbed lay exposed under open sky. The first explanation came quickly and comfortably: drought, reduced flow, upstream pressure, climate strain. All the reasons that have been used before, all the reasons that make sense at least at a distance, because when a river disappears, the expectation is simple: cracked earth, uneven mud, scattered debris, the residue of water that once moved without direction or design. But that's not what appeared here. What emerged was not randomness, it was form. The ground did not break apart. It revealed lines. Edges held their direction instead of fading into erosion. Sections of earth didn't slope, they dropped, sharply, cleanly, as if boundaries had been waiting beneath the surface. The longer the water stayed away, the clearer it became. This was not a riverbed being emptied. It was something being uncovered. And then, within that emerging pattern, there was a shift. Not wide enough to draw attention from afar, not dramatic enough to be called a collapse, but distinct, a narrow opening embedded into the exposed ground, positioned at an angle that did not follow the terrain around it. It did not look broken, it did not look forced open. It looked placed. Those who approached it did not immediately understand what they were seeing. At first, it appeared as shadow, just another depression where light didn't reach. But as the angle of the sun changed, and as light was directed inward, the shape began to resolve. Not darkness. Depth, a controlled descent leading inward at a steady angle, and then, unmistakably, structure. Steps. Not carved roughly, not worn by time, but consistent. Each one held the same height, the same spacing, descending downward in a pattern that did not vary. There was no irregularity, no broken edges, no signs of natural formation. The corners were too clean, the alignment too exact. This was not erosion. It was construction. That realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, as each detail confirmed the next. Because caves do not form like this. Natural tunnels slope, collapse, twist under pressure. They do not produce evenly spaced steps, they do not maintain angle with precision, and they do not guide movement. But this did. Each step led to another, not randomly, but intentionally. The descent did not force entry, it directed it, downward, steadily, without interruption. And yet, there were no signs of use. No worn edges, no disturbed surfaces, no debris that would suggest recent movement. It was intact, untouched, as if it had not been exposed by time but released by condition. The further light reached, the more the structure revealed itself. Walls began to take shape along the sides, not vertical cliffs, but controlled boundaries, slightly angled inward, reinforcing the sense that this was not an open void, but a contained passage. A corridor beneath the river. And what made it more unsettling was not just what it was, but what it wasn't. It did not feel ancient in decay. It felt preserved. And preservation implies intention. Something built to last. Something meant to remain unchanged. Something that was not meant to be found, at least not easily. Standing at the entrance, the difference becomes clear. This is not an empty space beneath the ground. It is not a hollow left behind by shifting earth. It is direction, a path, a descent that exists for one purpose: to lead somewhere. And once that becomes undeniable, the question changes. No longer, what is this? But why was it hidden? Because if this were simply a natural formation, it would not require precision, it would not require symmetry, it would not maintain structure after years, perhaps centuries, beneath moving water. It would not appear only when the river retreats in a specific way, at a specific time. It would have been seen before. But it wasn't. Not like this. The Euphrates has risen and fallen countless times throughout history. Seasonal changes, flood cycles, drought periods, Yet never has it revealed something this complete, this intact, this unmistakably designed, which means the timing matters. And that is where observation begins to shift into something deeper, because moments like this are not described in terms of explanation, but in terms of sequence. A change occurs, and something follows, not immediately understood, but recognized by pattern. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the
creepiest mine tunnels I've ever been in, just because of how dilapidated it is and all these chains hanging down.
Worse over by you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's way worse over here.
Get past you, man. I'm dying over here.
It actually looks pretty cool.
And are sometimes washed up on our shores.
Archaeologists also found the remains of other animals, including elephants, rhinoceros, and giant...
The Euphrates River, one of the oldest and most historically significant rivers on Earth, has shaped civilizations across the Middle East for thousands of years. It remains a lifeline for millions across Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. But now, its waters are rapidly receding. And as the river pulls back, it is exposing things that have left many people of faith both unsettled and deeply curious. So what is actually being revealed? If this caught your attention, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me as we uncover what's really going on. Before we get into the recent discoveries, let's find out if the Word of God speaks about the Euphrates drying up. For that answer, we turn to Google. The Middle Eastern country has been suffering the effects of increasing heat for several years, with government reports even warning that the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers could go completely dry by 2040. This year, water reservoirs along the Euphrates, such as the Qadisiyah Lake, showed significantly low water levels. It does appear to be so. Has the Euphrates River ever dried up before in documented history? Beneath a section of the Euphrates River that had only recently receded, a hidden chamber came into view, one that no prior survey, satellite scan, or historical record had ever identified. When researchers entered, they didn't find scattered artifacts or collapsed ruins. They found order. At the center of the space were 4 enormous restraints, positioned with unnatural accuracy, aligned to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Not arranged for display, but embedded as part of the structure itself. Each anchor point had been driven deep into the surrounding bedrock at identical angles, as if the chamber had been carved outward from those fixed positions rather than built inward. The material defied expectation. Every link appeared continuous. No seams, no hammering marks, no evidence of casting or welding. Surface analysis showed a density and composition that didn't fully match known ancient metallurgy. To replicate something similar today would require controlled conditions exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius, along with precision shaping that leaves no trace behind, something even modern fabrication rarely achieves without microscopic signatures. But it wasn't the construction that disturbed the team most. It was the condition. No oxidation. No mineral buildup, no structural fatigue. Despite being sealed beneath layers of sediment for what could be centuries or longer, the surface remained unnaturally smooth, almost reflective under light. Fine dust had settled across the chamber floor, yet none of it clung to the metal. And when one of the researchers moved closer, instruments began to register something unexpected, a consistent thermal reading. The chains were warm, not from surrounding rock, not from any visible energy source. Thermal imaging confirmed it localized heat contained within the metal itself. The temperature wasn't extreme, but it was stable. And it shouldn't have been there at all. There were no geothermal vents, no chemical reactions, no electrical activity detected in the area. And then came another detail easy to miss at first. Each restraint showed signs of tension, not damage, not breakage, but subtle strain patterns, as if something had once been held in place and was no longer there. It was at that point the parallels became difficult to ignore. The number, the symmetry, the river, all aligning with a passage in the book of Revelation 9:15. 4 beings bound at the great river Euphrates, held until an appointed time. A description centered not just on confinement, but on timing and eventual release. For centuries, That passage has been read as symbolic by many, literal by others. But standing inside that chamber, the distinction didn't feel as clear. Because what unsettles people is not just what might have been there. It's the possibility that something, once restrained, no longer is. Scripture has long carried a consistent message that restraint is never permanent. It exists within a timeline, and when that boundary shifts, it is rarely sudden. It builds, quietly, gradually. Like in the days of Noah, where change didn't announce itself, it accumulated, unnoticed, until it crossed a point of no return. So the deeper question isn't just about what lies beneath the earth. It's about what is unfolding above it. Because what the team documented beyond those now empty restraints, patterns in the surrounding walls, markings that didn't follow natural erosion, and a narrow passage leading further into darkness, suggested something undeniable. This wasn't the conclusion of a discovery. It was the beginning of one. Deeper inside the chamber beneath the Euphrates River, investigators came across something even more unsettling. Near the center of the floor, where sediment had settled into a thin, undisturbed layer, there were 4 distinct sets of footprints. Each impression was fully formed. Heel, arch, toes, clearly defined, but larger than any human footprint recorded in the region. The edges were sharp, not crumbled or distorted, suggesting they were made after the chamber had already stabilized, not during a collapse or flood event. And they weren't random. The placement told a story. Each step followed a measured, deliberate path. The spacing between prints was consistent, longer than a human stride, yet not erratic. There was no overlap, no dragging, no hesitation. Whatever left them moved with balance and control. The depth raised even more questions. Based on compression patterns in the sediment, each step suggested a weight far beyond normal human range, roughly 180 to 230 kilograms. Yet, the pressure distribution was even, as if the weight was carried with stability rather than force. No slipping, no shifting. Another detail stood out. Fine particles of dust had settled across most of the chamber, but inside the footprints, the surface remained slightly darker, as if the impressions were more recent than everything around them. Not freshly made, but not ancient either. All 4 sets began near the fractured restraints and continued in the same direction, leading deeper into a narrowing passage where the light could no longer reach. None of them turned back. No overlapping tracks. No signs of return. Just 4 paths, moving away. Some have drawn connections to the book of Revelation 9:15, which speaks of beings released at a specific moment in time. Others suggest an unknown geological or environmental explanation: pressure shifts, sediment anomalies, something not yet understood. But one detail is difficult to dismiss. These were not marks left behind by something trapped. They were steps taken by something that had already left. As the team advanced further into the hidden chamber beneath the Euphrates River, the structure itself began to defy every expectation of a natural cave. The entrance wasn't rough or fractured. It was clean, almost engineered. Lines met at precise angles. Repeating patterns appeared along the edges. Even the curvature of the walls followed proportions that felt calculated, not formed by water or time. And then the walls began to change. Carved into the stone was a sequence of symbols arranged in a downward progression. Each marking shifted slightly from the one before it, similar, but not identical, forming what looked less like decoration and more like a system. The spacing between them was consistent, almost rhythmic, as if guiding movement deeper inside. Researchers noted that the pattern didn't match any known script or ceremonial markings. Instead, it suggested something else entirely: intervals, stages, a measured progression toward a fixed point. Subtle details added to the mystery. The carvings grew sharper the deeper they went, as if they had been preserved differently or created at different times. In some sections, faint mineral deposits outlined the symbols, highlighting them in a way that made them stand out even in low light. And then they saw the warnings. Etched across multiple sections of the chamber walls, repeated with precision, was the same message preserved in 17 ancient languages, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Aramaic, Old Persian, and early Proto-Semitic forms. Civilizations separated by centuries, even millennia, yet all conveying identical phrases. Do not open, remain sealed, until the appointed time. No known historical site has ever combined these languages in a single unified inscription, yet here they appeared together aligned, deliberate, and remarkably intact. It wasn't random overlap. It suggested continuity, a message carried forward, protected, and repeated with one purpose: to warn. At that moment, the discovery no longer felt purely archaeological. It began to echo something far older, something recorded in the book of Daniel 12:4, where words are sealed until the time of the end, and in the book of Revelation 5:1, where a scroll remains closed until the moment it is meant to be opened. The pattern is consistent. Not everything is lost to time. Some things are intentionally hidden, preserved, until a specific point. But the warnings don't just point to a place beneath the earth. They point to something deeper, because throughout Scripture, the greater danger was never only what was concealed, but how easily truth is overlooked when it's right in front of us. So the real question isn't just what was sealed inside that chamber. It's whether we are meant to recognize it now. And if there truly is a moment written into history, are we prepared when it arrives? If this is making you think differently, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this isn't just a discovery. It's a pattern that may already be unfolding. And just when it seemed the chamber had already revealed its purpose, another discovery altered the entire picture. Farther inside the cavern beneath the Euphrates River, beyond the reach of natural light, and partially concealed by collapsed stone, investigators identified a structure that clearly did not belong to the surrounding layout. It wasn't part of the chamber's geometry. It stood apart from it. Massive, motionless, intact. A stone sarcophagus. Its scale alone immediately raised concerns. This was not designed for a human body. The proportions extended well beyond standard burial dimensions, longer, wider, and deeper, as if it had been constructed to contain something far outside normal human form.
Now to the story of a sea monster with 130 razor-sharp teeth.
Authorities shut down the Euphrates River cave after discovering traces of ancient civilization.
Exploring underwater, divers found massive skeletons that looked disturbingly human. Who or what did these belong to?
Not a storm, not an earthquake, but a river disappearing. The Euphrates is drying up, and what's being revealed beneath it is stopping people in their tracks. Ancient caves, hidden structures, massive skeletons, and reports of a creature with over 100 razor-sharp teeth, unlike anything ever recorded. In Book of Revelation, there's a line that has sparked debate for centuries. Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. Just symbolism? Or something beginning? And long before that, Book of Genesis spoke of beings that didn't belong to the natural order. Is this coincidence? Or a pattern? If you're starting to see it, like, subscribe, and comment. I see it. And stay with me, because this may only be the beginning. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment people could point to and say, this is when everything changed. At first, it looked familiar. Lower water levels, exposed banks, a river under pressure from heat, drought, and time. The kind of environmental shift that has been seen before, explained before, measured and recorded as part of a larger pattern. But then it kept going. The Euphrates didn't just recede, it withdrew. Sections of the river began to disappear entirely. Channels that once carried steady flow turned into broken stretches of cracked earth. What used to be a continuous body of water became fragments, isolated, shrinking, disconnected. Satellite data confirmed what people on the ground were already witnessing. In multiple regions, water levels had dropped by as much as 90%, not gradually, not seasonally, but sharply enough to expose terrain that had remained hidden for generations, possibly far longer. And that's when the attention began to shift. Because this was no longer just about water. As the river pulled back, it revealed what had been beneath it. Long sections of the riverbed opened up, exposing layers of earth that had not seen light in thousands of years. The ground did not appear to simply dry. It looked preserved, sealed, as if it had been held beneath the surface, untouched and contained. There was no smooth transition between water and land, no gradual blending. The boundary appeared abrupt, defined, almost unnatural in its clarity. Local observers began documenting the transformation. Areas submerged weeks earlier were now fully exposed. And what stood out wasn't just the speed, it was the consistency. Different locations, same pattern. Water pulling back, ground emerging, silence following. It didn't feel like a cycle. It felt like a shift. Environmental explanations still applied. Rising temperatures, upstream dam systems, reduced rainfall, each contributed to the decline. Each made sense on its own. But something about the scale and the timing began to raise a different kind of question. Not whether it could happen, but why it was happening like this. Because the Euphrates is not just a river. For thousands of years, it has stood as a boundary between lands, between empires, between eras. It has carried life, sustained civilizations, and marked the edges of history itself. And now, that same river was losing itself, piece by piece. There is a passage in the book of Revelation that has been debated, interpreted, and often understood symbolically, but its wording remains precise. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. For generations, that verse has been read as prophecy, something distant, something not meant to be taken literally, something to be understood in meaning, not in physical reality. But what happens when something long considered symbolic begins to resemble something observable? That is where certainty begins to weaken. Because regardless of interpretation, one fact remains: the river is disappearing. And not quietly. As the water recedes, everything around it begins to respond. The soil shifts, the air changes, sound travels differently across exposed ground than it does over water. Entire ecosystems begin to adjust to the absence of something that had always been there. Boats rest on dry land where they once floated. Fishing paths lead to empty ground. Shorelines expand into spaces that were never meant to be walked. And with each passing day, more of the riverbed is revealed. Not collapsed, not destroyed, just uncovered. That distinction matters, because collapse suggests failure, but exposure suggests something else entirely, something that was covered and is no longer meant to be. At this stage, no conclusion needs to be forced. The evidence remains simple. A river is losing water. Land is emerging. Patterns are shifting. But even now, one detail stands out. It's not just the loss. It's what that loss is allowing. Because when something that has been hidden for thousands of years begins to surface, the story does not end with a river. It begins beneath it. At first, it was just shapes. Irregular lines breaking through the surface, dark patches beneath the thinning water, subtle changes in texture that didn't quite match the surrounding riverbed. From a distance, it could still be mistaken for natural erosion stone, worn down by time, sediment shifting under pressure. But the closer people looked, the harder it became to explain it that way. Because these weren't random formations. As the Euphrates continued to recede, entire sections of the riverbed began to reveal something more defined. Flat surfaces, straight edges, angles that held their form instead of dissolving into the landscape. What first appeared as scattered fragments slowly connected into something larger, something structured. Stone foundations emerged in patterns that didn't belong to nature, lines intersecting at deliberate points, sections that suggested walls, boundaries, even passageways. Not fully visible yet, but enough to make one thing clear: this had not formed on its own. And then came the openings. Narrow at first, almost easy to miss. Dark voids cutting into the exposed ground, partially filled with shadow, partially buried under layers of silt. But as the waterline dropped further, those openings expanded. Their outlines sharpened. Their depth became more apparent. They weren't cracks. They were entrances. Some led downward at shallow angles. Others dropped abruptly into darkness. Around them, the surrounding ground remained intact. No signs of collapse, no evidence of recent breakage. It didn't look like the earth had split open. It looked like something had been there, waiting to be revealed. That difference changed everything, because when something is uncovered by accident, it usually shows damage, disruption, irregularity. But what was appearing along the Euphrates carried a different signature. It felt preserved, contained, as if the river hadn't buried it, as if the river had been covering it. Observers began documenting repeated patterns across multiple sites, not identical structures, but similar characteristics. Stonework aligned in consistent directions, surfaces that appeared intentionally leveled, entry points positioned in ways that suggested access, not collapse. The deeper the exposure went, the more the question shifted. This was no longer about whether something was there. It was about what it was and why it had been hidden. Because the scale didn't match a single structure. It hinted at something broader, a network, perhaps, or multiple sites connected by purpose, if not by physical proximity.
The descent did not force entry, it directed it, downward, steadily, without interruption. And yet, there were no signs of use. No worn edges, no disturbed surfaces, no debris that would suggest recent movement. It was intact, untouched, as if it had not been exposed by time but released by condition. The further light reached, the more the structure revealed itself. Walls began to take shape along the sides, not vertical cliffs, but controlled boundaries, slightly angled inward, reinforcing the sense that this was not an open void, but a contained passage, a corridor beneath the river. And what made it more unsettling was not just what it was, but what it wasn't. It did not feel ancient in decay. It felt preserved. And preservation implies intention. Something built to last. Something meant to remain unchanged. Something that was not meant to be found, at least not easily. Standing at the entrance, the difference becomes clear. This is not an empty space beneath the ground. It is not a hollow left behind by shifting earth. It is direction, a path, a descent that exists for one purpose: to lead somewhere. And once that becomes undeniable, the question changes. No longer, what is this? But why was it hidden? Because if this were simply a natural formation, it would not require precision, it would not require symmetry, it would not maintain structure after years, perhaps centuries, beneath moving water. It would not appear only when the river retreats in a specific way at a specific time. It would have been seen before. But it wasn't. Not like this. The Euphrates has risen and fallen countless times throughout history. Seasonal changes, flood cycles, drought periods. Yet never has it revealed something this complete, this intact, this unmistakably designed. Which means the timing matters. And that is where observation begins to shift into something deeper. Because moments like this are not described in terms of explanation, but in terms of sequence. A change occurs, and something follows, not immediately understood, but recognized by pattern. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way. Revelation 16:12. The text does not explain how the river dries. It does not define the mechanism. It defines the moment and what comes after it. Preparation, access, the removal of something that once stood in the way. Standing at that opening, the meaning becomes difficult to ignore. Because this was not just land exposed, it was access revealed. The descent did not collapse into the earth. It did not open violently. It appeared quietly, precisely as if it had always been there, waiting for the condition that would allow it to be seen. And that is what makes it different from every other discovery. This was not found by digging. It was not uncovered by force. It was revealed. And whatever lies beyond a passage like this is not random. It is connected to the structure above it, to the river that covered it, to the timing that exposed it. Because entrances like this do not exist alone. They lead somewhere. And whatever waits at the end of a descent like this was never meant to be seen all at once. This wasn't a cave, it was an entrance. What lay beyond the descent did not reveal itself all at once. It didn't open into a single chamber or a collapsed void. Instead, it expanded slowly. As if the deeper one moved, the more the structure allowed itself to be seen. At first, it was fragments. A wall straight, uninterrupted, holding its line where natural rock should have broken apart. Then another. Then a corner that didn't belong to chance, but to design. And then something unmistakable. A layout. Not scattered remains, not debris, but arrangement sections connected in ways that suggested planning, not accident. The deeper the descent continued, the clearer it became that this was not a cave system. It was a city. Hidden beneath the Euphrates River, sealed not by collapse but by time and water, a complete structure began to emerge. Walls extended into pathways, pathways opened into rooms, rooms connected into larger spaces shaped for living, not hiding. Homes. Structures that still held form, entryways that remained visible, thresholds marking the transition between inside and outside, still recognizable after thousands of years. And what made it more unsettling was not the age, it was the condition. Because this did not look like a civilization that had been destroyed, it looked like one that had been covered. There were no signs of fire, no ash, no collapse that spoke of violence. The structures still stood. Worn, yes, aged, certainly, but aligned, connected, functional in their layout, as if paused rather than ended. And that is where the meaning shifts. Because ruins tell a story of destruction. This did not. It told a story of interruption. Archaeological patterns pointed toward the Mitanni civilization, a Bronze Age culture dating back around 3,400 years. A people known through fragments of history, through inscriptions and references scattered across time. But never like this. Never complete. What stood beneath the river was not just evidence of their existence. It was continuity. Streets held direction. They connected spaces with intention. Storage areas appeared near structural centers, while smaller rooms aligned in patterns consistent with daily life. This was not reconstruction. It was preservation. And that changes everything. Because when something is destroyed, it scatters. When something is buried, it fragments. But when something is covered, it remains. When something is buried, it remains. Waiting, not in a conscious sense, but in condition, held in place beneath layers that concealed it without erasing it, protected by the river that flowed above it for centuries, masking its presence completely, until now. And that raises a question that refuses to settle. Why was it never fully revealed before? The Euphrates has shifted countless times, floods, droughts, seasonal changes, yet this remained hidden, intact, untouched in a way that suggests not randomness, but timing. Because timing changes everything. And that is where the pattern begins to echo something deeper. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1-9. This is not just about repetition. It is about return. Standing within that city, it becomes clear this was not something from the past being discovered. It was something returning to visibility, not by excavation, not by force, but by sequence. The river shifts. The ground reveals. The descent appears. And beneath it, continuity. Because if this were simply a lost civilization, it would have been found differently, through fragments, through broken pieces requiring reconstruction. But this did not require imagination. It presented itself. And that is what makes it difficult to ignore. Because the structures did not suggest chaos, they suggested order. They did not suggest collapse. They suggested pause. As if the moment of disappearance was not destruction but covering. a transition from visible to hidden, not from existing to gone. And now that transition is reversing. The city is not being rebuilt, it is being revealed. And once that distinction is understood, the implication shifts. Because if one layer of history can remain intact beneath the surface for this long, unseen, untouched, then the question is no longer about what we have found. It becomes about what else remains, hidden, waiting for the same moment, the same sequence. Because this city did not rise again. It was always there. It wasn't destroyed, it was hidden. The deeper the exploration moved into the city beneath the Euphrates River, the clearer it became.
The Euphrates did not begin by disappearing. It began with something far harder to ignore. One morning, the Euphrates looked as it always had. Murky, slow, struggling to survive. By afternoon, the entire river had turned blood red. Not a faint tint, not a temporary stain. A deep, heavy, thick crimson. The color of fresh blood, stretching for miles in both directions, as if the river itself had been struck by the hand of God. Fishermen on the banks dropped their nets and fell to their knees. Women screamed, children ran. At first, authorities rushed in with every test known to science, chemical analysis, biological scans. Water samples rushed to laboratories in Baghdad and beyond. Every single report came back the same. Nothing. No toxins, no red algae, no industrial spill, no bacteria. No explanation on Earth could account for what was happening. The water had simply changed, and it kept spreading. Within hours, videos flooded the world. Drone footage showed the crimson current flowing like an open wound through the desert. Satellite images captured the blood-red vein, cutting across ancient lands once called Babylon. And then the pattern became undeniable. Similar reports began surfacing from other rivers connected to the same ancient system. Waters turning red in places far apart, yet all linked by the same prophetic geography. This had happened before. In Exodus chapter 7, when Pharaoh's heart was hard, Moses struck the Nile, and the waters of Egypt became blood. Fish died. The river stank. It was not merely a miracle, it was a judgment sign, a warning before greater plagues fell. Now, thousands of years later, another river, sacred to prophecy, has turned the same color. But this time, the sign does not stand alone. Fish began to surface, but not in the way typical of contamination. They weren't gasping or thrashing. Many were already still, scattered, floating without pattern. No foam, no visible discharge upstream. No smell strong enough to explain a sudden die-off. It didn't look like pollution, it didn't behave like oxygen depletion, and it didn't last long enough to be either. Scientists remain silent. Governments offer weak excuses. Yet the Word of God has never been silent about moments like this. In Revelation 16:3-4, the Apostle John saw it clearly. The second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, and it turned into blood, like that of a dead man, and every living thing in the sea died. The third angel poured out his bowl on the rivers and springs of water, and they became blood. The Euphrates is bleeding. Creation itself is groaning louder. And something far worse is moving beneath those red waters. In the days following the sudden discoloration, the Euphrates continued to recede. Not dramatically, not violently, but steadily. The kind of withdrawal that doesn't demand attention at first, until the ground it leaves behind starts to form shapes that don't belong to nature. The Euphrates River, the same river that once roared through the cradle of civilization, is disappearing before our eyes. Satellite images from the last few years show a shocking truth. Water levels have dropped by nearly 90% in many stretches. Wide sections that once required boats to cross can now be walked across on foot. Riverbeds that were hidden for centuries now lie cracked and gasping under the desert sun.
At first, it didn't look significant, just another irregular gap in the earth. But as more of the surrounding sediment collapsed and slid away, the outline became clearer. This wasn't random erosion. It was an opening, a cave. What made it unsettling wasn't just its presence, but its position. This cave had not been accessible before. There were no paths leading to it, no signs of previous exploration, no evidence that anyone had entered from the surface in recent years. For as long as records could suggest, it had remained completely sealed, hidden beneath the continuous flow of the river. And yet now, without excavation, without drilling, without any human intervention, it stood exposed. That distinction matters, because this wasn't a discovery made through effort. It wasn't uncovered by searching. It appeared because something above it moved away. The water didn't reveal fragments. It revealed an entrance. Observers described how the surrounding ground didn't simply dry out, it gave way. Sections of sediment collapsed inward, but not in a chaotic pattern. It was as if the layers had been holding their shape until the pressure shifted, and once it did, the structure beneath was allowed to show itself. Inside, the darkness wasn't gradual. Light from the outside reached only a short distance in before being absorbed. The interior remained still, silent, and undefined. No airflow, no visible movement, just a fixed space that felt separated from everything around it. There were no carvings near the entrance, no markings to indicate purpose, no tools, debris, or signs of habitation. If this had ever been used, it left no surface evidence behind, which raises the question, was it ever meant to be accessed from above at all? Because everything about its emergence suggests that it wasn't discovered. It was revealed. And that difference shifts the meaning. In moments like this, when something long hidden becomes visible without human effort, the event begins to feel less like exploration, and more like timing. Not because of what is found inside, but because of how it becomes visible in the first place. As written in Book of Luke 8:17, "For nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open." What had remained unseen beneath the river for decades, possibly centuries, did not emerge slowly. It appeared in a single shift, at a moment no one had planned, in a place no one had reached. And now that it is open, the question is no longer what it is, it's what it leads to. Those who approached the cave didn't describe fear at first. They described a shift. The moment they stepped inside, the air felt different. Not colder in a sharp, immediate way, but heavier, dense, as if it had been sitting there, unchanged, for a long time. There was no breeze moving through the entrance. No airflow pulling inward or pushing outward, just stillness. And then came the silence. Not the kind that follows when sound fades, but the kind that seems to absorb it. Footsteps didn't echo the way they should. Voices didn't carry. Even small movements felt muted, as if the space itself was holding them back. That's what stood out. Because caves, even deep ones, usually respond. They shift air. They reflect sound. They move in subtle ways. This one didn't. It felt contained, not just hidden, but preserved, as if whatever existed inside had been held in place. Not exposed to time, not shaped by change, but kept exactly as it was. And crossing that threshold didn't feel like entering a natural space. It felt like stepping into something that had been waiting. The change didn't begin with snow. It began with the air. Inside the cave beneath the Euphrates River, Nothing behaved the way it should. There was no sudden drop in temperature like stepping into a cold environment, no rush of air from deeper within, no breeze pulling through the entrance. Instead, the air felt still, unnaturally still. At first, it was subtle, not cold enough to alarm anyone immediately, not different enough to be named. But the longer anyone remained inside, the more the feeling settled in. The temperature wasn't shifting the way natural spaces shift. It wasn't moving. It was holding. That's what made it difficult to process. Because caves respond. They breathe. Air circulates, pressure changes, sound travels and returns. But here, none of that was happening. The air felt dense, almost layered, as if it had remained undisturbed for a long time. And then something changed. Not from above, not from outside, but directly within the space itself. Thin traces began to appear along the surface of the stone. At first, they looked like residue, fine, pale dust settling along the edges of the cave floor. Nothing unusual, something that could be explained. But they weren't being carried in.
It has carried life, sustained civilizations, and marked the edges of history itself. And now, that same river was losing itself, piece by piece. There is a passage in the book of Revelation that has been debated, interpreted, and often understood symbolically, but its wording remains precise. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. For generations, that verse has been read as prophecy, something distant, something not meant to be taken literally, something to be understood in meaning, not in physical reality. But what happens when something long considered symbolic begins to resemble something observable? That is where certainty begins to weaken. Because regardless of interpretation, one fact remains: the river is disappearing. And not quietly. As the water recedes, everything around it begins to respond. The soil shifts, the air changes, sound travels differently across exposed ground than it does over water. Entire ecosystems begin to adjust to the absence of something that had always been there. Boats rest on dry land where they once floated. Fishing paths lead to empty ground. Shorelines expand into spaces that were never meant to be walked. And with each passing day, more of the riverbed is revealed. Not collapsed, not destroyed, just uncovered. That distinction matters, because collapse suggests failure, but exposure suggests something else entirely, something that was covered and is no longer meant to be. At this stage, no conclusion needs to be forced. The evidence remains simple. A river is losing water. Land is emerging. Patterns are shifting. But even now, one detail stands out. It's not just the loss. It's what that loss is allowing. Because when something that has been hidden for thousands of years begins to surface, the story does not end with a river. It begins beneath it. At first, it was just shapes. Irregular lines breaking through the surface, dark patches beneath the thinning water, subtle changes in texture that didn't quite match the surrounding riverbed. From a distance, it could still be mistaken for natural erosion stone, worn down by time, sediment shifting under pressure. But the closer people looked, the harder it became to explain it that way. Because these weren't random formations. As the Euphrates continued to recede, entire sections of the riverbed began to reveal something more defined. Flat surfaces, straight edges, angles that held their form instead of dissolving into the landscape. What first appeared as scattered fragments slowly connected into something larger, something structured. Stone foundations emerged in patterns that didn't belong to nature. Lines intersecting at deliberate points, sections that suggested walls, boundaries, even passageways. Not fully visible yet, but enough to make one thing clear. This had not formed on its own. And then came the openings. Narrow at first, almost easy to miss. dark voids cutting into the exposed ground, partially filled with shadow, partially buried under layers of silt. But as the waterline dropped further, those openings expanded. Their outlines sharpened. Their depth became more apparent. They weren't cracks. They were entrances. Some led downward at shallow angles. Others dropped abruptly into darkness. Around them, the surrounding ground remained intact. No signs of collapse. No evidence of recent breakage. It didn't look like the earth had split open. It looked like something had been there, waiting to be revealed. That difference changed everything. Because when something is uncovered by accident, it usually shows damage, disruption, irregularity. But what was appearing along the Euphrates carried a different signature. It felt preserved, contained, as if the river hadn't buried it, as if the river had been covering it. Observers began documenting repeated patterns across multiple sites, not identical structures, but similar characteristics. Stonework aligned in consistent directions. Surfaces that appeared intentionally leveled. Entry points positioned in ways that suggested access, not collapse. The deeper the exposure went, the more the question shifted. This was no longer about whether something was there. It was about what it was and why it had been hidden. Because the scale didn't match a single structure. It hinted at something broader. A network, perhaps. Or multiple sites connected by purpose, if not by physical proximity. The kind of presence that suggests long-term design.
What used to be a mighty flow has become a thin, sickly stream, struggling to survive. Scientists point to the usual explanations. Dams built upstream in Turkey and Syria choking the river's lifeblood. Relentless drought made worse by climate change. Overuse by farmers and cities fighting for every last drop in a region scarred by war. They show us graphs. They give us data. They speak in calm, logical voices. Yet even they admit something deeper is wrong. The drying is happening faster than any model predicted. Entire ecosystems are collapsing overnight. And as the waters recede, they are not just exposing sand and rock. They are uncovering things that should have remained buried. Local farmers and fishermen who have lived beside the river for generations say the same thing. This is not normal. This is not just drought. They speak of nights when the ground trembles without any earthquake, of strange lights flickering above the drying banks, of a heaviness in the air that makes even the bravest men whisper prayers they haven't spoken since childhood. The Euphrates is not simply drying. It is being uncovered on purpose, and what lies beneath may be the very reason the river was commanded to dry in the first place. As the waters continued to retreat, the riverbed began to surrender its deepest secrets. At the edges of the riverbed, where wet sediment began to dry and crack, straight lines appeared. Not fractures, not erosion patterns, lines that held their direction, edges that met at angles too clean to be accidental. At first, they were dismissed. Rock shelves, collapsed terrain, the remains of known settlements long catalogued and forgotten. But then more appeared. What emerged from the cracked mud was not simple pottery or scattered stones. Entire cities, buried settlements that had slept for thousands of years, suddenly saw daylight again. In the region near the ancient city of Raqqa and further downstream, archaeologists stood speechless as massive stone foundations rose from the silt. Low walls, carefully cut blocks, and the outlines of palaces and temples that no living man had ever mapped. Carbon dating placed some of these structures between 3,400 and 4,000 years old, older than many of the greatest empires we thought we knew. One discovery in particular sent shockwaves through the academic world: the lost city of Mitanni, a sophisticated kingdom with advanced canal systems royal palaces, and cuneiform tablets still bearing the names of kings long forgotten. The river had hidden it. Now, the river was revealing it. But it wasn't only cities. Dozens of ancient tombs began surfacing along the banks. More than 40 Byzantine-era graves in a single stretch, some still sealed, others cracked open by the drying earth. Inside, human remains, golden jewelry, and artifacts that spoke of lives lived in the shadow of Babylon. Further downriver, workers uncovered something even older. Massive stone platforms, altars, structures deliberately aligned with celestial events. Some stones bore markings that experts still cannot fully translate. Symbols that seem to mix known Mesopotamian script with something older, something that feels out of place in human history. The archaeologists came expecting relics. They left carrying questions they could not answer in their reports. Why now? Why all at once? Why in the exact region the Bible highlights as the stage for the final battle? Because this is not random excavation. This is revelation. The Euphrates is peeling back the layers of time exactly as prophecy said it would, exposing the bones of old kingdoms so the world can see that nothing built by man lasts when God decides the hour has come. No shared mechanism, no direct line of influence, only timing. And that's where the pattern became harder to ignore. Because while each event could be explained on its own, classified, documented, filed under known categories, they began to form something else when placed side by side. Not a system, a sequence. One event, then another, not simultaneous, but not isolated, as if each one followed the last, not by location, but by order. And that's the detail that shifted the focus, because the question was never whether these things could happen. They can. The question is whether they would happen like this, close enough to overlap, different enough to avoid direct linkage, frequent enough to suggest acceleration. And just as the Euphrates continued to reveal more beneath its surface, structures, symbols, alignments, the outside world began to reflect something similar, not in form, but in behavior. Small disruptions, unstable ground, unusual movement in places that had remained quiet. Nothing extreme, nothing definitive, but not nothing. Because when multiple systems begin to shift, not violently, but persistently, it doesn't always look like a single event. It looks like pressure, distributed, subtle, but building. And whether that pressure connects back to what's being uncovered, or simply coincides with it, remains unanswered. But the overlap remains. And for the first time, the pattern is no longer confined to what lies beneath one river. It begins to extend outward, across regions, across systems, across events that on their own make sense, but together begin to feel like they're following something, not reacting, following. Look at the pattern. Not one river, not one nation, not one sign, but everything, everywhere, moving in perfect, terrifying harmony. While the Euphrates bleeds and groans and spits out giants and ancient seals, the Jordan River on the other side of the region is doing the exact same thing, drying, revealing buried cities, sounding trumpets from the deep. At the same moment, across the Atlantic in the United States, sinkholes are swallowing streets, ancient trees are dying in hours, deep-sea creatures are washing ashore alive, and strange crosses of light appear in the sky. In Jerusalem, the very center of prophecy, the ground trembles. Hail falls while missiles fly overhead, black birds circle the holy sites, and silence falls like a heavy curtain before judgment. These are not separate events. They are movements of the same symphony. different continents, different rivers, different skies, yet all playing the same notes at the same appointed time. The Euphrates dries to prepare the way for the kings of the East. The Jordan reveals what was hidden beneath holy ground. The land of America shakes as if warning a nation once called to be a light. And Jerusalem, the city that cannot be ignored, stands as the beating heart where heaven and earth collide. This is not chaos. This is coordination. This is the Creator, orchestrating every element of creation to shout the same message in every language, on every shore, through every trembling mountain and every drying riverbed. The time is near. Jesus said, "When you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." Not one thing, not two, all these things. And right now, every single category he warned about is rising at once. From the groaning of creation to the signs in the heavens, from the uncovering of ancient evil to the division tearing nations apart. The Euphrates is not alone. It is simply the loudest voice in a global choir already singing the final verse. And if you can still hear it, then you still have time to respond. At this point, nothing stands alone anymore. Not the river, not the structures, not the symbols, the sounds, the void, the chains, or the movement captured in the ground. Each piece can still be explained. On its own, a river changes color. Archaeological remains are exposed. Unknown markings appear on ancient walls. Subsurface sounds emerge from shifting terrain. Global events unfold in different regions. None of these are impossible. In fact, history is filled with them. Rivers have dried before. Civilizations have been uncovered beneath sand and sediment.
Millions in Syria and Iraq are facing water shortages as the region's longest river, the Euphrates, dries up.
And what was found inside has shaken the foundations of history, faith, and prophecy.
Along the Euphrates River, the water not only receded but also rose, revealing a landscape no one was allowed to see all at once. As the river receded, a sealed cave opened up beneath its surface, and those who entered felt the air change, heavier, colder, stranger. Then the unbelievable happened. Frost formed, then snow fell, deep inside the cave where no sky could reach. A few moments later, a low, repeating sound emanated from below, as if something underground was beginning to move. Near the entrance, a gigantic, crocodile-like creature, over 6 meters long, was reported to have been seen standing as if guarding what lay beyond. Deeper still, archaeologists discovered an ancient altar, echoing accounts from the book of Joshua. And whispers begin to rise again about what is written in the book of Revelation, where the Euphrates River is described as a boundary preventing something until a predetermined time. Is this the moment the Bible warned of? Could the Euphrates River now be the site of the events prophesied in Revelation chapter 9? One thing is certain: what is about to be revealed will leave you speechless. Follow us to the end. And if you feel something spiritual, leave a short prayer below. The Euphrates River has dropped to critically low levels, low enough to trigger warnings across the region. But this isn't just another drought. Because the river didn't gradually shrink, it pulled back. Within a short span of time, large sections of the riverbed were exposed, far beyond what seasonal decline would normally reveal. What should have taken months appeared in days. The waterline didn't ease downward. It retreated, leaving behind cracked sediment, dark channels, and surfaces that had not seen light in decades. And that's where the concern begins, because the pattern doesn't match typical environmental behavior. In a normal drought, a river thins, slows, fragments. Here, the change feels abrupt, almost directional. Not a fading, but a withdrawal. People along the banks noticed it immediately. Not just the level, but the way it happened. There was no sense of a system running out. It felt more like something was being uncovered. That distinction matters because this river was never described as just water. In Book of Revelation 16:12, it is written that the great river Euphrates would one day be dried up to prepare the way. Not destroyed, not vanished, but prepared, as if its function was always tied to something beyond itself. And even earlier, in Book of Genesis 2:14, the Euphrates is named as one of the original rivers flowing from Eden, a boundary, part of the first order established on the earth. So when a river like this begins to change, not slowly, but suddenly, the question shifts. It's no longer just about water levels, it becomes about timing. Because when something described as a boundary begins to pull back, it raises a possibility that goes beyond environment, into sequence. Not what is happening, but why now? This isn't a single event. It's the beginning of something unfolding. As the water along the Euphrates River continued to withdraw, the exposed ground did more than crack. It opened. Not in scattered fractures or shallow depressions, but in a way that revealed something structured beneath it. A darkened entrance began to take shape along one section of the riverbed, partially buried under layers of hardened sediment that had just hours earlier been submerged. At first, it didn't look significant, just another irregular gap in the earth. But as more of the surrounding sediment collapsed and slid away, the outline became clearer. This wasn't random erosion. It was an opening, a cave. What made it unsettling wasn't just its presence, but its position. This cave had not been accessible before. There were no paths leading to it, no signs of previous exploration, no evidence that anyone had entered from the surface in recent years. For as long as records could suggest, it had remained completely sealed, hidden beneath the continuous flow of the river. And yet now, without excavation, without drilling, without any human intervention, it stood exposed. That distinction matters, because this wasn't a discovery made through effort. It wasn't uncovered by searching. It appeared because something above it moved away. The water didn't reveal fragments. It revealed an entrance. Observers described how the surrounding ground didn't simply dry out, it gave way. Sections of sediment collapsed inward, but not in a chaotic pattern. It was as if the layers had been holding their shape until the pressure shifted, and once it did, the structure beneath was allowed to show itself. Inside, the darkness wasn't gradual. Light from the outside reached only a short distance in before being absorbed. The interior remained still, silent, and undefined. No airflow, no visible movement, just a fixed space that felt separated from everything around it. There were no carvings near the entrance, no markings to indicate purpose, no tools, debris, or signs of habitation. If this had ever been used, it left no surface evidence behind, which raises the question, was it ever meant to be accessed from above at all? Because everything about its emergence suggests that it wasn't discovered, it was revealed, and that difference shifts the meaning. In moments like this, when something long hidden becomes visible without human effort, the event begins to feel less like exploration, and more like timing. Not because of what is found inside, but because of how it becomes visible in the first place. As written in Book of Luke 8:17, "For nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. What had remained unseen beneath the river for decades, possibly centuries, did not emerge slowly. It appeared in a single shift, at a moment no one had planned, in a place no one had reached. And now that it is open, the question is no longer what it is, it's what it leads to. Those who approached the cave didn't describe fear at first. They described a shift. The moment they stepped inside, the air felt different. Not colder in a sharp, immediate way, but heavier, dense, as if it had been sitting there, unchanged, for a long time. There was no breeze moving through the entrance. No airflow pulling inward or pushing outward, just stillness. And then came the silence. Not the kind that follows when sound fades, but the kind that seems to absorb it. Footsteps didn't echo the way they should. Voices didn't carry. Even small movements felt muted, as if the space itself was holding them back. That's what stood out. Because caves, even deep ones, usually respond. They shift air. They reflect sound. They move in subtle ways. This one didn't. It felt contained, not just hidden, but preserved, as if whatever existed inside had been held in place, not exposed to time, not shaped by change, but kept exactly as it was. And crossing that threshold didn't feel like entering a natural space. It felt like stepping into something that had been waiting. The change didn't begin with snow. It began with the air. Inside the cave beneath the Euphrates River, nothing behaved the way it should. There was no sudden drop in temperature like stepping into a cold environment. No rush of air from deeper within. No breeze pulling through the entrance. Instead, the air felt still. Unnaturally still. At first, it was subtle. Not cold enough to alarm anyone immediately. Not different enough to be named. But the longer anyone remained inside, the more the feeling settled in. The temperature wasn't shifting the way natural spaces shift. It wasn't moving. It was holding. That's what made it difficult to process. Because caves respond. They breathe. Air circulates, pressure changes, sound travels and returns. But here, none of that was happening. The air felt dense, almost layered, as if it had remained undisturbed for a long time. And then something changed. Not from above, not from outside, but directly within the space itself. Thin traces began to appear along the surface of the stone. At first, they looked like residue, fine, pale dust settling along the edges of the cave floor. Nothing unusual, something that could be explained. But they weren't being carried in. There was no wind, no movement, and yet they continued to form. Slowly, those thin traces began to gather. They thickened along the rock, spreading across the surface in patterns that didn't follow cracks or moisture lines. They formed where nothing had been just moments before. What looked like dust became something sharper, crystalline, frost, and then more than frost. The formations didn't drip or freeze over from existing water. There were no visible signs of moisture pooling or seeping through the stone. No condensation forming on the walls. No cycle that connected what was happening to anything outside the cave. The frost expanded outward as if it was growing from the rock itself. That's when the silence inside the cave began to feel different. Not empty, but occupied. Not quiet, but contained. The formations continued to build, layer by layer, surface by surface, and then, unmistakably, the texture changed. What had been thin and crystalline became soft, loose, recognizable, snow, resting along the cave floor, gathering along ledges, forming in a place where no sky existed, where no cloud could reach, where no weather system could enter. That's what broke the pattern completely. Because snow doesn't appear without process. It requires air movement, temperature gradients, moisture suspended and carried. It forms through sequence, through a chain of conditions that can be traced, measured, explained. None of that was visible here. There was no transition from wet to frozen, no droplets forming and turning to ice, no airflow to carry particles into the cave, no external drop in temperature that could justify what was happening inside. Only the result remained: snow.